serving as Master of Ceremonies for our program this evening. I would like to welcome you on behalf of the West Roxbury Rosendale chapter of the John Birch Society. If you will all rise, we will open the meeting with an invocation given by Bill. Please remain standing for the Pledge of Allegiance.
God bless Ambassador Funderburk and the men and women of the John Birch Society as they lead the way in the battle against the forces from within and without and outside the government that are working to destroy our God-given rights. God bless the men and women in the audience tonight who have come seeking knowledge and information. For we know that only an informed people can hope to retain and be worthy of that freedom with which the United States of America has been blessed. God bless our efforts in seeking to retain our God-given rights and informing others in hopes of bringing about less government, more individual responsibility, and with God's help, a better world. Amen.
Amen. Let's all put our hands over our hearts and face the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Please be seated. I will now call on Harold Shurtleff, the New England coordinator for the John Birch Society, to introduce our featured speaker, Mr. Funderburk.
Now, before I introduce the ambassador, I'd like to bring up Senator Hedlund. Senator Hedlund sponsored a resolution in the Massachusetts State Senate this afternoon honoring David Funderburk, and Mr. Funderburk spoke in front of the State Senate.
Thank you. I was excited to learn that my good friend Ambassador Funderburk was going to be in town today, and we were fortunate enough that we were in session today and had him address the State Senate today, and I was proud to sponsor a resolution which we were able to get through today honoring Ambassador Funderburk, and I'd like to take a moment to read this to you. Commonwealth of Massachusetts resolutions honoring David Funderburk. Whereas David Funderburk was appointed the United States Ambassador to Romania by President Ronald Reagan in 1981, and whereas during his tenure David Funderburk was an active and outspoken opponent of the communist regime of Nicolae Ceausescu, which terrorized the Romanian people for decades, and whereas Ambassador David Funderburk opposed exporting technologically advanced equipment to the government of Romania because of the atrocities committed by this regime, and because of his belief that positive action by the United States would contribute to the elimination of these atrocities. And whereas Ambassador Funderburk disagreed with and consistently challenged the conciliatory approach taken by the State Department of the United States toward Ceausescu, which eventually led to his resignation as the United States Ambassador to Romania. And whereas recent events, including the popular revolt which overthrew the Ceausescu government, reflect most positively on the convictions of Mr. David Funderburk, now therefore be it resolved that the Massachusetts Senate congratulates David Funderburk for his leadership and for his actions which demonstrated the courage of his convictions during his tenure as ambassador to Romania. And be it further resolved that a copy of these resolutions be transmitted forthwith by the clerk of the Senate to David Funderburk, signed by myself and offered by myself, Senator Robert Hedlund, and signed also by the President of the Senate, William M. Bolger. So I'd like to make this presentation to the ambassador and welcome him back to the Boston area. I think it's been about a year since he fortunate enough to see the ambassador speak over at BU last year, and he was as good as he was that night. You're in for a treat tonight, so enjoy the talk.
We have a problem tonight. It looks like we're running out of chairs. These are the kind of problems that I really like for a speech. There are but few times in history when a person of extraordinary character steps from behind the drawn curtains of foreign policy to tell the truth. Many of you may know about the first person to do so, Arthur Bliss Lane, the former ambassador to Poland. He spoke honestly about the U.S. betrayal of Poland, which he documented in his book, I Saw Poland Betrayed, and we do have copies back there. The second such person is with us tonight. From 1981 to 1985, he served as U.S. Ambassador to Romania, having been appointed by President Reagan. Our speaker resigned from the ambassadorship to speak out against U.S. foreign policy, collaboration with communist dictators. He has addressed hundreds of audiences across the country, warning of the external communist threat and of the insider betrayal of America. He has been featured on national TV and radio and has written several books on the subject. Pinstripes and Reds, If the Blind Lead the Blind, and Betrayal of America. And incidentally, we have the books available, Betrayal of America, as I mentioned, and the ambassador will be able to autograph some tonight. Our speaker received Fulbright and IREX fellowships for study in Romania, served as a U.S. Information Agency officer, and received his Ph.D. in History and International Studies from the University of South Carolina. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome a great man who has the courage, integrity, and patriotism to tell it as it is, Ambassador David Funderburk.
Thank you very much, Hal, for those very kind words. Fellow Americans, I would like to pay tribute to Senator Bob Hedlund, a good friend of mine, for the nice gesture, the honor that he bestowed on me today. It was very nice to be touring historic Boston, to be surrounded in the state senate by pictures and monuments of our founding fathers. It recalls their courage, their special sacrifices, their faith, which those people in Eastern Europe, where I lived for over 6 years, those who love freedom, look to us and to you as their model. The least we can do is be true to that distinctive heritage and not let a Studs or a Frank or a Kennedy or a Flynn or even a Weld take it away.
Amen. All right.
I am here because our freedoms are in danger. Our constitutional republic and our way of life are more threatened today than ever before, and more so by our own political leaders than ever before, not just the external enemy or adversary. I'm here because time is running out before America wakes up to a new world order. I'm here because I have children. I'm here because I lived in the communist world for over 6 years. I witnessed Big Brother and big government up close and personal. And I'm here because I support the educational efforts of the John Birch Society. To give you some of my background and tell you where I'm coming from, what has happened since I resigned from the position. I was living just a few years ago in a 24-room mansion with a heated indoor swimming pool, gardeners, maids, cooks, butlers, a chauffeured limousine. We had a KGB colonel as the driver for this armored limousine with the American flag on one side, the State Department flag on the other. We had the best food in the world flown in from West Germany and the United States to this elitist compound where we were living like royalty. We could send our children to the best private academies and schools in Western Europe and the United States. The salary at that time was $75,000, more than $50,000 in addition in fringe benefits. Today it's about $200,000 total. I could have stayed on in that position for another 4 or 5 years throughout the Reagan term. I had lived, however, in Eastern Europe and in Romania on 4 previous occasions, often in the shoes of the people with families and people there who had suffered political and religious persecution, who had been in jail, and who paid a heavy price for their beliefs. So, if you have a conscience, it bothers you to go day after day to luncheon, dinner, reception, cocktail parties, and watch decadent diplomats click glasses with communists from China and the Soviet Union and Romania. I got tired of reading about the horrors of Nicolae Ceausescu and other communist regimes. I reported these to Washington, and they were ignored. I was circumvented. I met George Bush in his office in the White House. I met Ronald Reagan. George Bush and Barbara Bush came to Romania. Betty and I hosted them there. I briefed him on Air Force 2, flying from Belgrade, Yugoslavia to Bucharest, Romania. And I said, you're aware, of course, that every week pastors and priests are being killed by this monster. You're aware that every week churches are being destroyed, drugs, terror, military armaments are being exported around the world, and you have bizarre policies which are repressive to all the people in this country who hate this man. So we shouldn't be in bed with him any more than we should any other communist dictator. So for God's sakes, when you go in to meet Ceausescu, George Herbert Walker Bush, please put down a marker for human rights, put down a marker for everything that we stand for in this country, our principles, our values, our heritage, and tell him that we will not continue to grant most favored nation treaty status and continue to give aid and assistance to anybody that carries out policies as you do. Unfortunately, George Bush had been briefed before that time by the State Department, the NSC, and other people in the establishment. He proceeded to praise Ceausescu and to assure this monster you've seen on television, Christmas 1989, who was executed. But, you know, the world should have known about this long before. If the media had cared, the world hasn't known about a lot of horrors and atrocities that have taken place in Eastern Europe and Communist China and other places. But the sad thing was that George Bush apparently was much more concerned about protecting the interest of some friends who had financial investments and were undertaking trade with Communist Romania at that time, in the same way that he's more interested with the 400 American corporate, bank, and business heads who are dealing with the Communist Chinese than he is with the thousands of students who were slaughtered in Tiananmen Square. So it didn't come as a surprise to me to see the policy of our president, our administration, our State Department, vis-a-vis Gorbachev, vis-a-vis Deng Xiaoping. It was the same policy I witnessed firsthand, vis-a-vis a monster hated by virtually everybody in the country of Romania. So I gave up this mansion and this plush life and perhaps a track to other jobs in the establishment. I wrote a book and I tried to expose this policy of the Bush administration. Even after writing this book, it was made very difficult for me to ever try to get it published. I had to submit the manuscript to the U.S. State Department, the Pinstripes and Reds book, which I wrote initially, describing my experiences caught between the State Department and the communists in Romania and in Eastern Europe. And they sat on the book and they wouldn't give me permission to print the book. So eventually, I had to hire an attorney who explained to the State Department that I had some rights as a citizen. And so they didn't block it. They never gave me permission, actually, to go ahead and to print the book. Then I was recruited to run for the United States Senate. And when I ran for the United States Senate, the State Department, with the knowledge of George Bush, trotted out to the major media, both in our state and nationwide, 24 spokesmen, unnamed spokesmen for the State Department who took pot shots at me. And what they said essentially was, well, the problem with Funderburk was that he was one of those flag-waving patriots. You know, at the 4th of July, we had several thousand people at the American residence, and we flew the American flag and we played the national anthem. That was America's territory there, and I thought that's what the heck I was sent there to do. And so that's what we did. And that's one reason that I was criticized in the major newspapers, because I was playing the national anthem and flying the flag. I've had subsequent problems in terms of telephone calls from the Bush White House with regard to things that I mentioned in Pinstripes and Reds. Questions being, are you going to continue to write about this particular case? Do you know any more about it? Are you going to bring it out during the election? This was in 1988. At that time, I didn't have the total documentation, which I do have now, and much of it is in Betrayal of America. And it was this, that in all the years that George Bush was dealing with communist Romania, and you could ditto this for most of the other communist countries around the world, he only lifted a finger one time, as far as I know, for any immigration case, any human rights case in that whole country, in that whole part of the world. And the case that he raised or showed interest in just happened to be someone who married into the family of former liberal Democrat governor of Pennsylvania, Milton Schaaf. And that family happened to be, according to an eyewitness who was beaten and who was in jail in the Gulag in Romania for many, many years, those family members that George Bush lifted a finger for to get out included a co-founder of the Communist Party of Romania, the party that helped create Ceausescu, and the man known throughout the Gulag system in Romania as the jailer who beat the political and religious prisoners and dissidents. And so one of these dissidents, who is a very good friend of mine who lives in Washington, said and wrote, of all the people in that country, you would think that America would be trying to save and to assist somebody who stood for freedom, religious or political, but not the one who was killing and crushing those who stood for it. So these are just a few of the experiences that I've had in terms of George Bush and what he was doing. I wanted to divide this talk into two parts. One is that, of course, caution and skepticism should be the order of the day, not euphoria with regard to what's happening in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. And the second would be how it is that America's establishment, America's leaders, America's insiders, always put the interest of themselves or communist bosses ahead of the interest of those suffering under communism, striving for freedom, and ahead of the interest of the American people. With regard to Soviet communism, the Soviets have done a pretty good job in this country, with the help of the major media, of convincing most Americans that communism is dead. The Soviet Union now has democracy. Gorbachev is a Democrat and a reformer. The Central Soviet government is no more. The government is with the republics today. That's where the power is. So it was very interesting for me to read in the Boston Herald today, the Wall Street Journal yesterday, that the 12 republics of the Soviet Union now, excluding the Baltic nations, declared that they were signing a treaty for an economic union. And this would also include a union which would cover the whole ground of coordination of activities from communications to defense. In other words, you see what has taken place is that on one day we were told there was no longer a union, and they all had declared independence except for one or two republics. So the independence was with the republics. So today we're seeing again, here's a union again. So here there was a union initially, then there were republics, and now we're back to the union again. Well, no, I'm afraid I would have to say that there's been the union there all along. And of course, there was no real problem to let, to some extent, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia go. They make up less than 1% of the territory of the Soviet Union. And they're not completely gone in the sense that Soviet troops, over 300,000, by the way, are going to be stationed there right into 1994. So if they gain independence, they won't gain sovereignty. It'll be more along the lines of what has taken place in Finland, with the Soviets having a veto. And of course, they were the issue that seemed to get America's attention much more than the other ones. Also, part of this projection has been that the KGB is being transformed into a harmless organization. We don't have to worry about the KGB anymore. It's under new reform leadership appointed by Gorbachev himself. Also, we've been told that the Soviet people may starve this winter. So we've got to rush over there with as much aid as possible to prevent this starvation. Well, a couple of points on this. Every report that's credible that I've been able to see, whether it's from the former Undersecretary of Agriculture or the International Council of Wheat in London in last week, have stated that there is no danger of massive starvation inside the Soviet Union this winter. I mean, this is all if we consider that our aid would go to the people who need it anyway, which of course it does not. It never has. So that the facts show, and even the Wall Street Journal reported last week, that of the $1.5 billion that we sent for food aid last winter, over 2/3 of it went not to any people on the verge of starvation, but to black marketeers and members of the Communist Party nomenclatura. That's where it went. So here we are in recession. Taxes going up everywhere in Connecticut, Massachusetts, and all over the country. And the Soviet Union has a debt to Western creditors of $68 billion, which will never be repaid to anybody. And we're talking about sending a massive infusion of assistance into the Soviets, a grand bargain, a massive bailout, starting with food aid to people who don't need the food aid and who aren't going to get it. And when I was in Romania, this was always the argument of the major media. Well, the poor Romanians are starving. They need our help. The poor Poles are starving. The poor Chinese are starving. That's why we have to have MFN. We can't break off ties with these people. The money goes to the Deng Xiaopings and the Nicolae Ceausescus and the Mikhail Gorbachevs and their gangs. The money doesn't go to the people who seek freedom or anything else that we stand for or believe in. Well, we don't have to be conned again and again. Before we close the books on the Soviet Union or a Soviet threat, let's consider a few things. Many of you are very much aware of these already, but I did want to add some ammunition for those people who are not familiar with all of these things. As Gorbachev returned from the Crimea following the so-called coup, he said, "I am still a communist." Or you can read, he said, "I am still a socialist," whatever you want to read there. On the ABC National Town Hall meeting, both Gorbachev and Yeltsin said, "We are atheists." Well, that must have been a shock to half the Americans who've been reading all these years that Gorbachev was really a closet baptized Christian. And seeing Yeltsin walk into Orthodox churches inside the Soviet Union. They even admitted, figuring nobody cared anyway in the United States, that they were atheists now. That bothers me, I should say. Gorbachev's new reform chief, Vadim Bakatin, said he was not going to release the names of any agents of the KGB. They were not going to release intelligence files on any of these people. And instead, as a matter of fact, he has kept on virtually all of the same KGB operatives. KGB, by the way, even at the admission of the Soviets, has killed over 20 million people in the Soviet Union. And today it has more uniformed troops than the U.S. Marines, and there are more KGB agents in the city of Moscow alone than all the CIA and FBI agents or officials worldwide, just to give you an example of it. So does anyone seriously believe that the new Yeltsin-Gorbachev reform, quote, chief of the KGB is going to open the real files and tell the truth about the attempted assassination of the Pope, Lee Harvey Oswald, what Alger Hiss told the Soviets, the true story of KAL-007 and the fate of Larry McDonald, high-level U.S. spies who were never caught, what senior U.S. and Western politicians were on the Kremlin's payroll. You think we're ever going to find out any of these things from this new reformed KGB? I wouldn't think so. Whatever comes out of there will be something that comes out of the Department of Disinformation of the KGB, which is one of their largest departments. You're aware that this peaceful Peace Prize winner, Gorbachev, just a few weeks ago, redeployed hundreds of mobile nuclear missiles, SS-25s, throughout the Soviet Union. This is the disarming pacifist Soviets. The Soviet military, with 4 million soldiers, is more than double the size of the U.S. military. Under Gorbachev, in the last year, the defense spending has risen from 26% to 36% of the GNP. Ours has decreased to below 5% of our GNP. This is under the peaceful Gorbachev. Gorbachev, the good, the great, the liberal, the Democrat, the reformer, all of these things that he's projected to be. So since 1988, the Soviets have built 415 new ICBMs to our 33, 29 warships to our 14, 6,500 tanks to our 2,200, 1,950 short-range ballistic missiles to our 0. Okay. According to Garry Kasparov, the world chess champion and a co-founder of the Democratic Party in the Soviet Union, Gorbachev has not carried out a single constitutional reform which has led to dismantling the totalitarian system of the Soviet Union. Well, of course, he's talked about reform, but he hasn't carried out any reforms. Well, the head of the U.S. Communist Party, Gus Hall, last week said, socialism and communism are not dead, they're on a detour. He said political life is something like a garden. Socialism is not an annual, It is a perennial. You can cut it, it will come up again. Georges Marchais, the head of the French Communist Party, said, "I am a communist now more than ever." Julio Anguita, the head of Spain's Communist Party, said, "Once a communist, always a communist." Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote in an article a couple of weeks ago, you know, there is no foundation for democracy in the Soviet Union because there is no political discipline and there is no feeling of repentance. And this is a key that I'll refer to again. He said during the last 3/4 of a century, the destruction of the souls of the people in the Soviet Union is the most terrifying thing that has ever happened. The fact remains that the KGB, the military, and the Communist Party apparatus and bureaucrats are not simply going to quietly disappear. Well, what about these developments in the words of Russians themselves? This is what some of them say. They say, you can throw away all of these symbols, you can drive the Communist Party underground, but what difference does it make? Just because these people are leaving the Communist Party does not mean we're suddenly living in a democratic country. And one lady put it this way, I'm sure the same people will be running things, they just won't call themselves communist anymore. And of course, most of the political leaders today in the Soviet Union and many East European countries who were communist yesterday or last week or last month or last year are today something else, they say. Socialists, social democrats, whatever, what many of them were in the very beginning, as a matter of fact. So you can change the name and you can change the face, but you cannot change the character of these people. A seminar at the American Society for the Defense of Tradition, Family, and Property put it this way: communism is not dead. It is yet a living danger. It has had over 70 years to learn from its mistakes, and the biggest mistake of all was to go around calling itself communism. That became a stigma in the West, apparently. It's much better to call yourself a socialist, apparently. Ask Bernie Sanders. Kidding. A self-manager or whatever. That's what they said. Anything but that word now, so shed the word. Okay. As you well know, communists still control virtually 1/3 of the face of the earth, either under that name or under their new name, socialist. If you take Albania, Bulgaria, and Romania, they were communists one day, and the next day the communists reformed themselves into socialist or whatever, Salvation Front, or whatever you want to call it. So we want to hope and we want to believe the best always, but there has to be caution, there has to be skepticism, there has to be realism based upon history. The one who is president of the Soviet Union even today, and isn't that amazing according to all that we've heard about how he's been in danger from 1985 right to the present. From the bad guys, the conservatives of all things, right? I mean, I thought conservatives wanted freedom and constitutional republics, and that we were trying to get rid of central governments and repression and totalitarianism. All of a sudden the media is calling these orthodox communists, big government repressors, they're calling them conservatives. Doesn't that gall you? Well, this one who is still president of the Soviet Union, you know very well, was installed in power by Yuri Andropov, known as the Butcher of Budapest, the one who was slaughtering Hungarians in 1956. He was a KGB chief, and he was the one who said, I like that Gorbachev. He's got a good smile. I think he can, pull it off in terms of projecting this face, this new reform to the people in the West, and they're going to buy it. So Gorbachev was put in to help maintain the communist system. They realized that economically it was falling apart and it did not work. And they knew they didn't have any money to rebuild this thing. So the only place to get the money was from Uncle Sugar or, the ones back in Washington and New York who've been helping all along from the days of Lenin to Gorbachev. You need a few more Arm & Hammers. So this is what they've been doing. The problem with Gorbachev is that he inherited the legacy of the Communist Party of Lenin and Stalin and Brezhnev and Andropov, the Communist Party which killed more people destroyed more churches and imprisoned more Christians than any government in world history. So would you trust the leader of a government system responsible for the deaths of 50% of the clergy in that country, 80% of the churches destroyed in that country, and over 40 million people, according to their own confession or admission, and according to ours, at least 60 million or more. In other words, 1 out of 4 people in the United States. If it took over here, then that means somebody in your family would be gone, would be dead. And you would never forget it, and nobody in your family would ever forget it. Well, that's the legacy of the guy that we're shaking hands with, our president thinks is the salvation for the Russian people, the Soviet people. Nobody there thinks that, but somehow he does. Well, he thought that about Ceausescu, and nobody there thought it. He thinks it about Deng Xiaoping, and nobody there, I'm sure, thinks it either. So Gorbachev's popularity in America is about 75%. Bush, as I understand, has dropped from 80 to 65. But anyway, Gorbachev's is 75. And in the Soviet Union, it's 10% or less, which ought to tell us something. His own people know him. He's the same one who said, "I'm a convinced communist, I shall remain one." We are moving toward a new world, the world of communism. We shall never turn off that road, said Gorbachev. He said, "Don't believe all you hear about glasnost and perestroika and democracy. These are for outward consumption, that is, us fools here in America. There will be no significant change in the Soviet Union other than for cosmetic purposes. Our purpose is to disarm America." What do you know? Bush obliged him last week. Unilateral disarmament. Gorbachev said just a few years ago, this is our purpose, you know. Disarm America and let them fall asleep. He didn't know most of America was already asleep, apparently. In America, where 75% of the people think Gorbachev is good and great, is half asleep or asleep, wouldn't you say? Well, beyond the human deaths and the destroyed churches,